Before we discuss what happened in 2019, we need to understand something fundamental. The United States military doesn't build bases on empty land. They build on significant land. For over a century, the U.S. has established military installations, training grounds, and restricted zones across territories that hold deep cultural and spiritual significance to Native peoples. This isn't conspiracy, it's documented history. From Fort Hood in Texas to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, from the Nevada test site to Nellis Air Force Base, the pattern repeats: remote wilderness, tribal land proximity, and a long silence from those who lived there first. What often goes unexamined is what those tribes were warning about when soldiers arrived in the American Southwest, particularly across Arizona, New Mexico, and southern Utah. There exists a region where military presence and indigenous warning converge. It's an area where the Diné people, commonly known as the Navajo Nation, maintain deep roots, oral histories, and explicit cultural prohibitions about certain entities. It's also an area where the military has maintained a presence for decades: training grounds, testing facilities, and restricted airspace. The entity we're discussing today exists at the intersection of these two worlds. To understand what soldiers began reporting in the 2010s, you need to first understand the Diné concept of Yi Naldlushi, commonly translated in English as skinwalker, though this translation carries significant distortion. The accurate framing, according to Diné elders and anthropologists who've studied the culture respectfully, is far more complex. In Diné belief systems, a Yi Naldlushi is not simply a creature or monster. It is fundamentally a human being, typically a medicine man or woman, who has chosen to use sacred knowledge for destructive purposes. The transformation is not magical in the fantasy sense, it's a deliberate act of spiritual corruption. A person trained in the sacred healing practices of the Diné practices that involve deep knowledge of nature, animals, plants, and the unseen world can pervert that knowledge by breaking fundamental taboos, speaking names that should not be spoken, and performing rituals in reverse. Such a person can change, not into a different being entirely, but into something that operates between states, between human and animal, between the visible and the invisible, between sanity and something else entirely. The Diné don't discuss this casually. The very act of speaking about skinwalkers in detail, particularly outside the family or community context, is considered dangerous. This is not superstition, this is protective practice. Because according to the tradition, to speak of them is to draw attention, and to draw attention is to invite presence. Several key attributes appear consistently in Diné accounts. Shape-shifting, not a magical metamorphosis, but the ability to move between forms. Witnesses describe seeing something that appears human one moment and distinctly animal the next, not as a transformation sequence, but as if the eye simply can't quite hold the shape in focus. Mimicry of human speech and behavior. The entity can replicate human voices with disturbing accuracy. Livestock calls, radio static shaped into words. Voices of loved ones speaking things only they would know. Abnormal movement and strength, speed that contradicts ordinary physics. The ability to cover distances that should require hours and minutes. Strength disproportionate to form. Psychological manipulation, perhaps most disturbing, the ability to induce terror, confusion, and false memory. Witnesses report not just fear, but a profound disorientation about what they've actually witnessed. Endurance. These entities appear immune to conventional harm. Bullets, traps, fences, nothing stops them permanently. The Diné understanding includes a crucial element. These entities cannot be killed, only repelled, and they are drawn to places of violation, where taboos have been broken, where sacred ground has been desecrated, where human arrogance has overridden traditional warning. The Diné have maintained their distance from certain territories for precisely this reason, not out of fear alone, but out of respect for the boundary between the human world and what lies beyond it. When the military established installations in these areas, that boundary became negotiable in the minds of those who didn't understand it existed. To properly establish credibility, we must acknowledge that modern military encounters with this entity are not the beginning of the story. They are the continuation. In the early 1900s, around 1905 to 1910, in what is now the Four Corners region of the Southwest, a series of incidents occurred that was recorded in limited form but never widely publicized. The incidents involved families living in remote areas of what was then largely unsettled territory. According to historical accounts preserved in oral tradition and in the private journals of Indian agents from that era, a family of 8, the names have been deliberately obscured in surviving records, reported a series of escalating encounters. It began with livestock dying in ways that suggested no ordinary predator. The deaths were methodical, targeted, The animals were left in positions that seemed deliberately placed, often in sight of the family dwelling. Then the noises began. The family described hearing voices, sometimes like wind, sometimes like human speech, calling their names from the darkness. The father, a man named only as Thomas in the available records, reported stepping outside one night to find what he described as a figure that moved wrong, standing at the edge of their property. He fired his rifle at it. The figure did not fall. Instead, it moved toward him with speed he described as not natural, and he fled back into the house. What happened next was the turning point. Over the course of 3 nights, family members reported seeing something at the windows. Always at night, always watching. The description was consistent, a human-like silhouette, but the proportions were slightly wrong. The head too large, the eyes reflecting light like an animal's. On the 4th night, the youngest daughter, aged 7, was found standing outside in her nightgown, completely unaware of how she got there, unable to recall the previous hour of her life. She had frostbite on her feet, despite it being a warm season. When questioned, she could only repeat, "It was walking, walking, and walking. I was walking with it, but I wasn't." Goodman never filed an official report on the incident, but in a personal letter to his superior, found in the National Archives, he wrote, "The local indigenous population seems to have genuine knowledge of a threat in this region. Whether this threat is real or sustained by mass psychological belief, I cannot determine. However, the consistency of their warnings and the reluctance of settlement in certain areas suggests either genuine danger or a deeply held cultural boundary that should be respected." Goodman's recommendation was that settlement in these areas be discouraged. It was ignored. Over the next century, there was a consistent pattern. Isolated incidents reported in remote areas, usually dismissed, usually resulting in silence. A shepherd who disappeared in 1927. A hunter found in 1949 miles from where he was last seen, with no memory of the intervening days. A Border Patrol officer in 1963 who reported something that wasn't shaped right pursuing his vehicle along the Arizona-New Mexico border and requested an immediate transfer. The pattern was always the same: report, investigation, dismissal, silence. The family abandoned their land 3 weeks later. They moved to a settlement closer to military jurisdiction, Fort Defiance, which had been established in 1851. The father, Thomas, spoke to an Indian agent named George Goodman about the incidents. According to Goodman's surviving notes, Thomas was articulate and clearly traumatized. Goodman, being a practical government official of that era, dismissed the account as hysteria and native superstition. However, Goodman's own follow-up notes, discovered decades later by researchers, indicated that he subsequently interviewed Dene elders in the area. Their response was notably consistent. They were not surprised. The elders indicated that the area had been known to be dangerous for generations. They stated that families were warned not to settle in certain valleys. They provided a name for what had occurred, though they were reluctant to repeat it, even in official government documentation. Then, in the modern era, the reports became more frequent, and they came from trained military observers. The military's expansion into the Southwest accelerated dramatically during World War II. The demand for training space, testing grounds, and remote installations grew exponentially. The Dene themselves became part of this history, the code talkers, Navajo men who served with distinction in the Pacific Theater, their language an unbreakable code. But the military footprint extended beyond human resources. It extended into geography, into land. By the late 20th century, the U.S. military controlled millions of acres in the Southwest. Fort Hood, covering 214,000 acres in Texas. Nellis Air Force Base and its vast restricted airspace in Nevada. Camp Navajo in Arizona. White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, spanning 3,200 square miles. Training ranges, testing grounds, places where only authorized personnel could go. These bases weren't random placements. They were chosen for specific characteristics: isolation, vast open space, minimal civilian population, and terrain suitable for training and testing. What was often overlooked was the historical significance of these locations to the tribes whose land they occupied. The military doesn't conduct environmental impact assessments based on spiritual significance. It conducts them based on water, geology, and proximity to civilian populations. The result was a systematic placement of heavily armed, heavily populated military installations directly adjacent to, or in some cases, directly overlapping, areas that tribal peoples had considered spiritually dangerous or explicitly forbidden for generations. The Diné, the Apache, the Ute, and others maintained their warnings. But warnings to a military institution designed for dominion over land and nature are not warnings that register. They are dismissed as cultural obstacles to be managed through bureaucracy and sensitivity training. By the early 2010s, something began to shift. Military personnel, men and women trained to observe, report, and operate in high-stress situations, began reporting incidents that contradicted every rational framework they'd been given. These were not civilians. These were trained soldiers, NCOs, and officers. Their careers depended on credibility, yet they reported. Incident 1, Fort Hood, Texas, March 2012. A National Guard unit conducting training exercises in the restricted training area south of Fort Hood reported an encounter that was logged in a confidential incident report, but never officially released. The account comes from a former corporal who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. According to this soldier, a squad of 8 personnel was conducting night navigation training in an area roughly 25 miles south of the main base. The night was clear. Visibility was good under moonlight. The unit was experienced. Most members had deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq. They were not prone to panic or exaggeration. Around 0230 hours, the squad began hearing vocalizations in the surrounding brush. The corporal described them as like coyotes, but not quite. Not the wrong pitch, necessarily, but the wrong pattern. Coyotes vocalize in specific ways, evolved over millennia. These vocalizations had an intentionality that seemed almost structured, as if something was experimenting with the sound, trying different variations. The squad leader ordered them to maintain position and continue the exercise. This was training. Every sound could be tested, understood, explained. Then the vocalizations changed. The sounds became more complex. And then, distinctly, they became human. Not human-like human. A voice calling out one of the squad members' names. Rodriguez, Rodriguez, come here, Rodriguez. Rodriguez was a relatively common name among the unit. But this was specific. This was Rodriguez's voice calling his own name, with inflections only Rodriguez would have. The squad leader ordered radio silence and told the unit not to respond. By protocol, they established a defensive perimeter and waited for daylight. The vocalizations continued for approximately 4 hours, periodically calling different names, using phrases that only members of that unit would know. At one point, something approximating the squad leader's voice described a personal detail about his family, information that had never been shared with the unit. As dawn approached, the vocalizations stopped. The unit remained in position until relieved at 0600 hours. When the relief squad arrived, they reported seeing no other personnel or unusual activity in the area. A search of the surrounding brush yielded nothing, no tracks, no evidence of human presence. The corporal who provided this account stated that the entire unit knew what they'd heard was not explainable by any standard military or wildlife framework, but there was no protocol for reporting it accurately. That the squad leader filled out the incident report as possible unauthorized personnel in training area, investigated, no findings. The real account was shared among the unit only, in private conversations that eventually leaked through military communities and underground military forums. The corporal stated, "We knew what we heard. We knew it wasn't right. But we had no way to report it without sounding crazy. So we didn't." Incident 2. Camp Navajo, Arizona, September 2015. Camp Navajo, established in 1942 and located in northern Arizona on land adjacent to Navajo Nation, is an ammunition storage facility operated by the Arizona Army National Guard. Its isolation and restricted nature make it ideal for storing munitions. Its location makes it deeply problematic from a cultural standpoint, though this concern is rarely discussed at the command level. In September 2015, a maintenance crew performing nighttime perimeter security checks reported an encounter that became the subject of internal investigation. The account comes from a sergeant who left active duty in 2018 and has since spoken about the incident in detail, though requesting anonymity for professional reasons. The sergeant was conducting a vehicle patrol of the southern perimeter fence with a private. The night was clear but moonless. Both soldiers were equipped with night vision goggles and thermal imaging. The equipment was military grade, well-maintained, and reliable. By any measure, they were better equipped to see in darkness than any standard observer. At approximately 0100 hours, the thermal imaging picked up a heat signature moving parallel to the fence line, roughly 200 meters from the patrol vehicle. The signature moved with clear intentionality, not an animal, not wind-blown debris, but a directed entity. The sergeant reported it via radio to the command post. Protocols required investigation. They drove toward the location. The heat signature moved away from them, maintaining distance but never accelerating beyond what appeared to be a running pace. The sergeant pursued, keeping the thermal image in sight. For roughly 5 minutes, this continued, the entity maintaining distance, the vehicle pursuing. Then the thermal signature stopped. It became stationary. The sergeant and private drove to within approximately 50 meters and dismounted. They activated their lights. Nothing. Empty ground. The thermal signature had vanished from their equipment, but they could see in the visible light of their flashlights something that caused both soldiers to freeze. In the distance, beyond where the thermal signature had been, they could see movement, but the movement was wrong. Something was walking on the fence line itself, the chain-link fence that stood approximately 8 feet tall. Whatever was moving was doing so along the top of the fence, balanced, running across the fence as though it were level ground. The movement was bipedal. The shape was distinctly human, but no human moves that way. No human has that stability or that speed. The sergeant's account indicated that both soldiers attempted to focus their weapons on the figure, but neither could acquire a clear sight picture. The figure seemed to slip in and out of focus, as though their eyes couldn't quite hold the shape in steady awareness. When they attempted to track it with the thermal imaging equipment again, it was gone. They returned to the command post and reported the incident as possible unauthorized personnel attempting to breach perimeter. A full investigation was conducted. No evidence of infiltration was found. No footprints, no cut fence, no tracks of any kind. The sergeant stated in his account, "We saw something we still can't explain. We were trained to report what we see. What we saw violated every law of physics and biology we understand. But the only way to report it honestly was to be accused of being unreliable witnesses. So we didn't push it." Incident 3, Fort Hood Training Area, June 2017. This account comes from an Army captain who was serving as a range officer overseeing live fire training exercises. The captain has since retired and agreed to speak with unusual directness about the incident, though still requesting anonymity given military community dynamics. The captain was observing a mechanized infantry unit conducting night movement drills in the Fort Hood restricted training area, the same region where the 2012 incident had occurred. The exercise was standard, vehicles moving under cover of darkness, using lights discipline, practicing tactical maneuvers. The training area had been quiet for several minutes when the captain's radio began receiving fragmented transmissions from unit leaders. The transmissions were fragmented not by equipment failure, but by apparent confusion. Unit leaders were reporting that personnel were unaccounted for, then accounted for. Positions were occupied, then vacant. The radio traffic took on an increasingly disorganized tone. The captain ordered a halt to the exercise and drove to the command post location. When he arrived, he found the commanding officer of the mechanized unit visibly shaken. The CO reported that approximately 8 minutes earlier, soldiers had begun reporting seeing something moving through the formation. The description was vague, soldiers reporting movement at the edge of their vision, movement that disappeared when they focused on it directly. More concerning, soldiers began reporting hearing voices, not from other squad members, but from the darkness surrounding them, voices calling out coded phrases, voices of family members, voices of fallen comrades. One soldier reported hearing his brother calling to him. His brother had been killed in a training accident 2 years prior. The soldier was so convinced of what he was hearing that he began moving toward the source of the voice, directly away from his unit. His squad leader had to physically restrain him. The captain made the decision to shut down the entire exercise and pull all personnel to a central rally point. He then drove the perimeter with a junior officer, searching for any sign of external personnel or explanation. They found nothing. However, the captain noted something that the initial reports had not captured clearly. On the eastern edge of the training area, he observed fresh tracks in the dirt. Tracks that appeared to be human, bipedal, heel-to-toe progression, but with stride length suggesting movement far in excess of normal human running speed. The tracks were deep, suggesting immense weight, and they terminated abruptly at a certain point, with no corresponding tracks showing the entity had moved away. The entity had simply stopped existing in that location. The captain's official report classified the incident as a training malfunction caused by soldier confusion and stress-induced hallucination. However, in private conversation with the retired former NCO who conducted this interview, the captain stated, "I've led soldiers in combat. I know what panic looks like. I know what hallucination looks like. That wasn't it. That was soldiers encountering something that broke their framework for understanding reality. And honestly, after what I saw in those tracks, it broke mine too." The incidents described above spanned 5 years and multiple installations. They share consistent elements despite being reported by different units, in different locations, under different circumstances. This consistency itself is significant. Military personnel across the country, with no knowledge of each other's accounts, describe similar phenomena using similar language. Then, in 2018 and 2019, the reports began to escalate in specificity and intensity. Soldiers were no longer only hearing vocalizations or seeing distant shapes. They were encountering direct manifestations, and more troublingly, some were encountering what appeared to be deliberate communication. A staff sergeant stationed at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico reported in 2018 that while conducting a boundary patrol, he encountered a figure standing approximately 30 feet from the fence line. The figure was described as human in shape but distinctly wrong. The sergeant reported, "Every proportion was off. The head was too large, the arms were too long, the legs seemed to bend at angles that shouldn't exist. But it was standing there, watching me, fully aware, intentional." The figure did not flee. Instead, it stood there for approximately 30 seconds, and the sergeant stated that during this time, he experienced an overwhelming sense of dread and paralysis. He could not move, he could not look away. He could not speak. The fear was not psychological. It was physical, a pressure in his chest, a freezing of his nervous system. Then the figure moved. Not ran, moved. The sergeant described it as walking but too fast, covering the remaining distance to the fence in what he estimated was impossible time. When it reached the fence, it did not climb over or attempt to breach. It simply stood on the other side of the chain link, facing the sergeant, and then raised its hand. The gesture was unmistakably human, a raised palm, fingers spread, a greeting, a warning, a question, but the hand was wrong. The sergeant reported 6 fingers. Then it was gone, not ran away, gone, simply absent. The sergeant called his command post to report the encounter, then immediately requested medical evaluation for stress-related incident. The evaluation found nothing psychologically amiss. The sergeant was medically cleared, but he never returned to boundary patrol duty. The anchor story. In early 2019, a private first class stationed at a National Guard facility near the Arizona-New Mexico border was assigned to a solo overnight watch at a remote monitoring station. The station was a small structure, self-contained, with communication systems and surveillance equipment. Its purpose was to monitor a section of restricted military territory. The private, who has agreed to speak on condition of anonymity and will be referred to here as James, was experienced and reliable. His service record was exemplary. He had no history of psychological issues or disciplinary problems. He was someone trusted with responsibility. James arrived at the monitoring station at 1,800 hours to begin his overnight watch. The station was equipped with communications, lighting, climate control, and surveillance monitors showing multiple angles of the surrounding area. He was not isolated in the field. He was in a structure, well lit, with direct radio contact to command post personnel. At approximately 2,130 hours, James reported via radio that all systems were functioning normally and that he had observed nothing unusual in the surrounding area. This report was logged. The command post acknowledged receipt. This was routine. At 2,245 hours, James reported again. Something had appeared on one of the surveillance monitors, specifically the eastern perimeter camera. There was movement in the area it was monitoring. James reported, possible wildlife in Sector 7, investigating feed from eastern camera. The command post acknowledged and instructed James to continue observation. What happened next was captured partially by the station's internal communication and recording systems, which continued to function throughout the incident. James reported that the movement on the camera appeared to be humanoid. It was walking along a fence line, moving at normal pace, showing no apparent concern for the surveillance equipment. James indicated he was going to attempt to identify the figure via the monitor systems. For approximately 3 minutes, there was silence. Then James's voice returned, and the command post noted a marked change in tone. James's voice was strained. He was breathing heavily. He reported, "There's something at the window." The command post asked for clarification. James reported, "There's something at the window. The east window. I don't know how it got here. I didn't see it approach on any monitor. It's just here." The command post asked if there was a security breach. James reported, "The doors are locked. The windows are intact. But it's at the window. It's looking in. It's looking at me." At this point, the command post initiated emergency protocols. They attempted to contact James, but he was no longer responding to radio. The station's surveillance feed was reviewed, and here's where the account becomes deeply disturbing. The eastern surveillance camera was no longer capturing anything. The camera appeared to have been deliberately obscured, not by covering it, but by something standing directly in front of it. Something that filled the camera's field of view completely, blocking all light, making the monitor appear dark. The entity never moved from that position. It simply stood there, obscuring the camera feed entirely. The command post initiated an emergency response. A rapid reaction team was mobilized and dispatched to the station. Response time was approximately 15 minutes. When the team arrived at the monitoring station, they found James on the floor of the main room, conscious but completely unresponsive to external stimuli. He was staring at the eastern window. His eyes were open, tracking something that was no longer there. He was nonverbal. His breathing was shallow. His pupils were dilated maximally. James was evacuated by medical personnel. A complete search of the facility and surrounding area was conducted. There was no sign of external entry. The doors and windows showed no damage or evidence of tampering. The locks were secure. However, the search team did find something on the east side of the building, approximately 200 meters away, a series of tracks. Human-shaped bipedal tracks, walking across the open ground toward the facility. The tracks were deep and widely spaced, suggesting rapid movement. The tracks approached the facility and then simply ended. There was no corresponding track showing departure. James was hospitalized for psychological evaluation and observation. For the first 3 days, he remained in a catatonic state, unresponsive to stimuli, eyes open but not tracking anything in his environment. On the 4th day, he began to respond to external stimuli. On the 5th day, he began to speak. What James reported was this. He had been monitoring the eastern camera feed when he observed the humanoid figure approaching the facility. He attempted to track it on other camera feeds, but it appeared on none of them. It should have been visible on multiple angles of approach. Instead, it simply appeared as if it had phase shifted into proximity to the building. When James realized something was wrong, he stood and moved away from the monitors toward the center of the facility. At that moment, he heard something that made his blood freeze, a voice. The voice was speaking his name. Not just his name, but his full name, his first name, middle name, his family surname, speaking all 3 names together, slowly, deliberately, with perfect pronunciation. The voice was his father's voice, but his father had died 6 years prior. The voice said his name again. Then it said, "Come outside." James reported that he knew immediately, and with absolute certainty, that whatever was producing that voice was not his father. But he also reported that the compulsion to obey the voice was overwhelming. His body was moving toward the door against his conscious will. He described it as like someone else was controlling my movements. He reached the door and began to unlock it. He was physically unable to stop himself. The physical act was happening, but his conscious mind was screaming against it. And then, for reasons he cannot fully explain, something changed. The compulsion stopped abruptly. His body froze. The door remained locked. At that moment, something struck the east window with immense force. The impact did not shatter the window, but it cracked severely. And in that moment of impact, James reported seeing a face pressed against the broken glass. A human face, pale, emaciated, but with eyes that were distinctly not human. The eyes were black, completely black. No iris, no pupil definition, just black. And they were looking directly at him. James screamed. He ran to the western side of the facility, away from the window, away from the face. He activated the emergency alarm. The alarm blared throughout the facility, and then the face was gone. The immediate pressure was gone. But James remained in a state of acute terror for the remainder of the night. When asked during his hospitalization what he had seen, specifically what he believed that face belonged to, James stated, "I don't know. I don't have a word for what I saw. It was using my father's voice to try to get me to go outside. And when that didn't work, it showed me what it actually was. It showed me what was hunting me." At this point, the command post initiated emergency protocols. They attempted to contact James, but he was no longer responding to radio. The station's surveillance feed was reviewed. And here's where the account becomes deeply disturbing. Following James's hospitalization, his account began to circulate within military communities. The official explanation released by the command post was that James had experienced acute psychological stress induced by isolation and the demanding nature of overnight monitoring duty. He was medically retired on the basis of service-connected disability. However, the account was not forgotten. Within months, a Navajo elder who had maintained contact with military personnel on adjacent tribal lands learned of the incident through informal channels. The elder, who has requested complete anonymity and will be referred to as grandfather, asked to meet with James. The meeting occurred 3 months after James's discharge at a location off military grounds. Grandfather brought with him another elder and a traditional healer. According to James's own account of the meeting, Grandfather listened to his entire story without interruption. When James finished, Grandfather was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that confirmed what James had come to suspect. What you saw was exactly what we have warned the military not to disturb. You built on land that was forbidden for a reason. You placed your structures on ground that holds the attention of things that should not be noticed, and now that thing knows you are there. Grandfather explained that the entity James had encountered was indeed what the Dine call Yi Naud Lushi, but he was reluctant to translate the term directly. He explained that the entity was not a supernatural creature, but something far worse, a human who had chosen corruption. A person who had abandoned humanity and embraced something that existed between the human and animal worlds. Grandfather indicated that the entity's appearance on military grounds was not random. Entities of this nature are drawn to places of transgression, places where the spiritual boundary between the human world and the wild world has been violated. A military installation built on forbidden land, operated with no respect for the cultural warnings, represented exactly the kind of transgression that such entities are drawn to. More troubling, Grandfather indicated that once such an entity has acquired awareness of a human presence, once it has made direct contact with a person's mind and name and family, the relationship does not simply end. The connection has been made. The entity now knows where to find that person. The person carries the entity's awareness with them. When asked if James was in ongoing danger, Grandfather was honest. Yes, but the danger is not that it will hunt him physically. The danger is that it will call him, and eventually he may answer. Grandfather recommended that James engage in specific protective practices rooted in Dine tradition. James agreed to work with the elder and the healer. According to James's own later report, the practices involved ritual purification, the creation of protective amulets, and daily practices of grounding and presence. Whether these practices are spiritually significant or psychologically therapeutic, James reported that they helped stabilize his condition significantly. When contacted for this narrative approximately 3 years after his discharge, James indicated that he still carries the experience with him, but that it has moved from acute terror to persistent awareness. He stated, "I know it's still out there. I know what happened to me was real, but I've learned to live with that knowledge without letting it destroy me." The elders understood something we didn't, and they were willing to help us even after we ignored their warnings. When we examine the incidents described in this narrative, several elements emerge consistently. First, the military installations in question are all located on or adjacent to land that tribal peoples have explicitly warned against. This is not coincidence. It is the systematic outcome of a culture that prioritizes strategic advantage over cultural respect. Second, the entities encountered show consistent characteristics: the ability to mimic human voices with perfect accuracy, impossible speed and movement, the capacity to induce psychological distress or control, and an awareness of human consciousness that suggests intelligence and intention. Third, once an entity has made direct contact with a human mind, once it has learned a name, once it has attempted communication, the connection appears to be permanent. The affected individual carries an ongoing psychological mark. Fourth, traditional indigenous protective practices appear to have measurable effects. Whether this is because such practices address a spiritual reality or because they provide psychological frameworks for processing trauma, the result is consistent. Individuals who engage with these practices show significantly better outcomes than those who do not. Fifth, and most significantly, the military has no institutional framework for processing these encounters. There is no protocol. There is no acknowledgement. There is only silence, followed by medical discharge, followed by the expectation that it never happened. This silence is, itself, perhaps the most dangerous element, because silence prevents the accumulation of institutional knowledge. It prevents the sharing of defensive practices. It prevents the military from taking seriously the warnings that tribal peoples have maintained for centuries. The Dine are not afraid of skinwalkers because of superstition. They are afraid because they have developed over generations a deep understanding of boundaries between human and animal, between the civilized and the wild, between what should be spoken of and what should not. The military, in its assumption of dominion over land and nature, has systematically violated these boundaries, and the consequences, though experienced only by individuals and kept silent through institutional pressure, are real. What we have presented here is not proof. It is not scientific evidence. It is a compiled narrative of testimony from individuals who experienced something that our current frameworks cannot adequately explain. Whether what these soldiers encountered was a literal entity, a manifestation of psychological trauma, an environmental phenomenon that science has not yet categorized, or something else entirely, the experiences are real, the fear was real, the effects were real. What is clear is this: the military built on land that indigenous peoples warned them not to build on. The military ignored cultural boundaries that had been maintained for centuries, and the military has responded to the consequences with silence and denial. The Diné, the Apache, and other indigenous peoples of the Southwest do not expect the military to abandon these installations. They understand that power structures do not simply relinquish control, but they do maintain hope for something simpler: respect, acknowledgement, a willingness to listen to warnings that are grounded in generations of hard-won knowledge. To the soldiers who experienced these encounters and found courage enough to speak about them, even with anonymity, your experiences matter. Your accounts contribute to a pattern of knowledge that connects the old warnings to the modern reality. That connection is important to those who maintain the old knowledge, the Diné elders, the Apache keepers of tradition, the indigenous peoples who have watched the military expand onto their land. Your warnings were not superstition. They were protective knowledge, and they deserve to be heard, not dismissed. The story of these soldiers and their encounters with something that defies rational explanation is ultimately a story about the consequences of arrogance. Arrogance in the assumption that we understand the world completely. Arrogance in the dismissal of knowledge systems that differ from our own. Arrogance in the belief that we can violate any boundary without consequence. If there is a truth in these accounts, it is this: not everything can be conquered. Not everything can be understood through the frameworks of military science and rational materialism. Some boundaries exist for reasons that predate our current civilization, and some warnings deserve to be heeded, not out of blind faith, but out of respect for the hard-won knowledge of those who came before. The soldiers mentioned in this narrative did not set out to encounter something beyond explanation. They were conducting training. They were performing their duties. They were doing what they were trained to do. But sometimes, reality contains elements that training cannot prepare you for. Sometimes the land itself has rules that supersede military protocol. And sometimes, the most important thing a person can do is listen to the warnings of those who understand what they are being told to ignore. If you've listened to this account and found yourself uncertain whether these experiences are real, that uncertainty is appropriate. We live in a time when our frameworks for understanding reality are incomplete. There are things we cannot explain. There are warnings we do not yet understand. The challenge is not whether to believe every element of this narrative. The challenge is whether we can listen to people who report genuine experiences without dismissing them, and whether we can show respect for knowledge systems that have maintained wisdom across generations. The soldiers who experienced these encounters were changed by them. Their lives were disrupted, their sense of reality was shaken, and they were asked to remain silent about it. But silence is the enemy of truth, and truth, whatever form it takes, deserves to be spoken. To those who have served in the military and felt that boundary between the rational and the inexplicable, your experiences deserve respect. Your accounts matter. And to those who maintain the old knowledge, who have warned about dangers that others cannot see, we are finally beginning to listen. Thank you for listening to this account. If you found this narrative compelling, please consider liking and subscribing to Military Stories for more accounts of military encounters that defy conventional explanation. We explore the intersection of military history, paranormal phenomena, and the testimonies of those who have experienced the inexplicable. Your support helps us continue to document stories that others won't tell. Thank you.